Welcome back, everybody. I'm Naha, and this is 30 Days of Tarot. And I hope that you're ready to put on your detective hats with me today, because we are going to delve deeper down the rabbit hole, looking at the esoteric past, the Kabbalistic lineage, the astrological correspondences of decks. Now, this is going to be a part 2 and a continuation of an earlier video from this series. I'm pretty sure that it was the third deck we opened. It was the Grand Esoterico. So go ahead, if you haven't already, check out that video here, and then come back and watch this part 2. So in the Grand Esoterico, we saw a deck that came out in the mid-1970s in Spain, and how it used attributions that came from Eudes Picard, and we'd also seen some similarities to Worth's deck. And again, go to that other video, get yourself caught up on the history, and so we can start with where we're at today. Now, this is the stuff I love the most about tarot, how you can sort of trace things back. You can see the influence of older decks, but how they evolved over time, and how artists took that information and then they made it their own, and they kind of updated some of the associations. They made it make more sense to them, and then they passed it on to the next person to see what they were going to do with it. So of course that esoteric lineage didn't stop in 76. And at the same time, this was a different vein that was going on in the decks that were put out by the Golden Dawn, which had already taken those correspondences and updated them, changed them. They moved the Fool. Instead of having the Fool, remember, at the end of the deck in between Judgment and the World, they placed the Fool at the beginning. And by doing that, they also shifted the entire Hebrew alphabet up one letter. So rather than starting Aleph, the first letter, with the first key, the Magician, Aleph now started with the Fool, the 0 card, which is a little confusing because you've got the first letter of the alphabet corresponding to 0, the second letter, bet, corresponding to the 1 card, and so forth. So there is something to be said for this older version, which kept the first letter with key number 1, the second letter with key number 2. Also, because the Hebrew letters have numerical values, and the numerical values are, for the first 10 letters, the same as the number of the letter. So Aleph equals 1, Bet equals 2, Gimel equals 3, and so forth. And so that's easy to remember what they are when you can look at them and say, okay, well, Aleph is 1 and it corresponds to the Magician, which is 1. Bet is 2 and corresponds to the High Priestess, which is 2. If you're already lost, I'm sorry, but if you're following along, basically Golden Dawn updated those things and shifted them, and what we're looking at is decks which used the old attributes. Now, if you remember, it was Worth that added the Hebrew letters to the Marseille-styled cards, and I showed you these from Wisdom in the Tarot. So here we have the Magician, the first key, and we have the letter Aleph, and then number 2, Bet. However, he didn't add the astrological associations. We don't see the zodiac signs, we don't see the planetary signs, and we don't see the elements. But we know that the 22 Hebrew letters also corresponded to those things, to the 12 signs, the 3 mother elements, and the 7 classical planets. How do we know that? Because of the source work of Kabbalah, the Sefer Yetzirah, otherwise known as the Book of Formation, and the 32 Paths of Wisdom, which lays out which letter corresponds to which planet, which element, and so forth. And again, the Golden Dawn changed the associations, but across all of the different versions that I've looked at, it seems like the zodiacal letters pretty much stay consistent. The elemental letters pretty much stay consistent. It's the planetary ones that change. And the ones that we see used in modern day occult groups that fall in the lineage of Golden Dawn definitely depart from what the Gra version of the Sefer Yetzirah says. So what I want to do today is show you guys a brand new deck, well, new to me, not a brand new deck, but another deck that's in this lineage, see how they did it, how they corresponded it. Is it the same as Grand Esoterico? Is it something different completely? Does it match up with Weight? Does it match up with Golden Dawn? We'll just have to find out together. So the deck that we're looking at today is one that I had to definitely do a little hunting for. It is also a deck that came out in the 70s, and from what I could find, it came out in the same year as the Grand Esoterico. So originally when I got this deck, I thought that it came out after. I thought it was kind of like in response to the Grand Esoterico. Then when I started looking it up, it looks like it came out the same year, 1976. While it has been reprinted, it's still hard to find. It's still kind of rare. I had to spend a little money on this deck, but I was able to find it on eBay. And I'm just gonna go ahead and open it and show you guys here. And I know that there are different versions of this deck, so there's a couple different boxes and a couple different editions. This is also published in Spain and also published by Fournier, who put out the Grand Esoterico. And this is called the Tarot BALBI. At first glance, I thought that this was the 22-petaled lotus in the center of the rose cross. It almost looks like that, which has the 22 Hebrew letters, but I'll show you guys up close. It's actually the zodiacal wheel, and then we see the yin-yang in the center. Very cool. And this is funny, actually. It still has the price tag on the back here. It says that it was sold from Game Center, and it was 4.75 pounds. I'm not sure how much that would be, but probably less than $10. And I don't see any date on here, but we might see that once we open it up. But before we do that, I wanted to show you guys something interesting because I already started doing a little poking around, and of course you guys know I consult the Tarot Encyclopedia, so I looked up to see if this deck was going to be in there, and sure enough it was. And the first thing that I saw was just on the standard page where it shows the deck. It says, the BALBI Tarot Pack was designed by Domenico Balbi and produced by Fournier in cooperation with U.S. Game Systems. So I thought that was interesting. I don't know to what extent the cooperation would have been. You know, U.S. Game Systems, that's Kaplan who wrote this encyclopedia. That's his company. And it doesn't really tell us much more about the history other than just giving us some description of the cards. But when I was looking in another section, there's an image here of the King of Swords, and it says, Vito Arienti, one of Italy's leading playing card collectors, is depicted as the King of Swords by Domenico Balbi, Italian painter and illustrator. And I thought, God, how cool, because this deck, once you see it, you're not going to think that these cards necessarily look like, they're not portraiture type cards. They're not cards that you would look at and go, oh, I can identify that as, you know, somebody that drew it from looking at a person or looking at their photograph. So I was surprised to see that this was actually a depiction of a real person. That being said, I was like, oh, one of Italy's leading playing card collectors? How do you get on that list? And then I found something really fascinating in the front of this book. So it's the second page of this book, like the title page. You guys, look at this. Now, this is an image from this deck. Here's the Emperor. Now you can see what I mean. You can see the style of the art, that you wouldn't necessarily think that this is drawn as an actual person that lived in real life. Well, listen to what the caption says. BALBI Tarot Card, a stylized rendition by Domenico Balbi of Stuart R. Kaplan as card number 4, the Emperor in the BALBI Tarot Pack. This is Kaplan. Balbi drew him and made him the Emperor. How crazy is that, right? So they must have known each other. They must have been friends. And I just thought that was like really, really surprising. So it says down here on the bottom of this card, BALBI 1975. And we know that this deck came out in 76, the same year as Grand Esoterico. And I looked at some of my Esoterico cards, and not on all of them, but on just this one that I found, the Moon, we actually see the date is right down here. You probably can't read it, but it says 7/11/75. So have you guys noticed that this 1975 thing keeps coming up? Look at for it in my last video too. It's just again and again we keep seeing that. So apparently 1975 being a very important year for the tarot. So the next thing I notice as I'm looking at this, I see, okay, this deck has both the Hebrew letters and it has an astrological correspondence. So we see this is the letter Dalet. Dalet's the 4th letter. We see that this is the 4th card, so we know that it's the older correspondences, the same ones that Worth used, the same ones that Maurizio used on Grand Esoterico. But then we see down here in the corner the sign for Jupiter. And Kabbalistically, Jupiter does correspond to the number 4. That is true. But just because Jupiter corresponds to the number 4 does not mean that it corresponds to Dalet. And I know, again, this might get a little confusing. So in Kabbalah and on the Tree of Life, you have the 10 spheres, which I've shown you guys as well. The spheres correspond to the 1s through 10s. The 4th sphere corresponds to all of the 4s, 4 of Wands, 4 of Cups, and so forth. And those correspond to Jupiter. However, of the 22 major arcana, there is also one of those arcana that corresponds to Jupiter, but it's not typically the 4th one. So it makes sense that there's Jupiter here because it's a card number 4, but typically Jupiter has to do with the minor card force, not the major. So I took a look at the Grand Esoterico to see their emperor, and I saw this. Now, we have the same letter here, Dalet. It's a little bit more stylized, so it doesn't look perfectly like that version. But here we see the astrological, the classical planet is the sun. And here's where I had to put my little detective hat on and go find in Sefer Yetzirah which is which and what is what. So what we see here is chapter 4, and it lists all of the 7 classical planets and the letters corresponding to them. God produced Dalet and referred it to fertility. He crowned it, combined it, and formed it with the sun in the universe. Okay, so there we have it. He corresponded to the sun. And if we look to Jupiter, Jupiter corresponded to the letter Tav. Now, Tav corresponds to the world. So let's look at the world, and we should see in the Grand Esoterico, because it's following this version, we should have Jupiter on the world. Okay, so here's the world, here's the letter Tav, and there's the Jupiter, right? So again, a little confusing, I know, but typically Jupiter will correspond to the 4s, the minor arcana 4s, and then it will correspond to one of the majors, but not necessarily the 4th major, the one that corresponds to the right letter. So the old deck used this. I don't know what BALBI is doing. We're going to figure it out for ourselves, and then, like I said, Golden Dawn changed it all completely again. So let's go ahead and start looking at these cards. Now, there's something else that I found really interesting that we're going to get into with the minors that I didn't realize when I was showing you guys the Esoterico before, but I think that both of these decks are going to use, which is a really weird attribution from Picard. Now, this little fold out begins with this. Who is BALBI? Oh, I love this already. Domenico Balbi, painter, designer, and engraver, was born in Genoa in 1927. After a course of studies in the Academy of Art of his native city, he moved to Paris, where he lived for some time to broaden his knowledge of art and esoteric philosophy. A man after my own heart. A special mention should be made among his works to his fascinating series of tarots, presented in the Municipal Library of Milan in 1961. Okay, so I guess he was doing tarot far before the 70s. He's taken part in numerous art exhibitions both in Italy and abroad, resulting in prizes and favorable opinions of his work. He has also given numerous conferences about the Kabbalah and the symbolism of tarots, and written diverse articles on metaphysical and philosophical themes. Now, I want to mention here that Kabbalah in this sense, and in the sense that I speak about it, this is Kabbalah spelled with a C. The Hermetic Kabbalah, which is my background and what I practice, is Kabbalah spelled with a Q. And it differs from Kabbalah, as you may have seen it, Kabbalah with a K, which is specifically a religious branch of Kabbalah. So Kabbalah with a C, Kabbalah with a Q is the esoteric and hermetic aspect of that. And it isn't a religion. It's more of a philosophy and a system. And so rather than a book, we see a fold out here. And we do see here that the letters are given, the Hebrew letters, but I don't see anything here about the attributes, the astrological signs. So let's start taking a look. I'll show you guys first the back of the cards. I'm not sure if this deck might have different backs depending on the edition that you have. And they're kind of a cool size. I like decks like this where they're a little bit larger, they're a little bit wider. Those Esotericos were very narrow, so you can see the difference here. They're the same height and much wider, and same publisher too. So I think it's interesting to see within one publisher how they really can switch things up. Here's a title card. This older deck is a used deck. And here we have the first card, El Mago, the Magician. And right off the bat, you guys are gonna see the really cool coloring that we see on these. They're almost a little bit psychedelic. Here's the first card where we're seeing one of the planets. So we have the third letter, Gimel. This is the third key. And then we have the planet Mercury. Now, according to my theory earlier, where they put the planet corresponding to the number, remember, that would be the next one, Emperor. We see the Emperor, the fourth letter, and Jupiter. However, that theory is now blown because Mercury is not the third planet. Mercury is the 8th planet. And the order of the planets is the Kabbalistic order. It's also called the Chaldean order of the planets. Now, there's something I showed you on the back of the Grand Esoterico before, which is this 7-pointed star that has all of the planets. It's the planetary heptagram. and that if you followed from point to point, you would go to the days of the week that correspond with the planets. Well, guess what? If you start down here at Saturn and you start going around in order, you actually have the Chaldean order. So you start with Saturn, that's 3, Jupiter 4, Mars 5, and so forth, to the moon, which is 9. So let's go ahead and look at the Grand Esoterico. And this one has Mars. You can see the letter is the same, and you can see some similarity in the image, but also very different. And here we see Mars, here we see Mercury. So let's go ahead and double check with Sefer Yetzirah. And here Gimel is associated with Mars. So again, we can determine that the Grand Esoterico follows this arrangement, and I don't understand what arrangement is being used in the BALBI deck. But I will tell you, you can definitely do a tarot reading. There's the Emperor in full-blown color, Stuart Kaplan, never would have guessed that. You don't have to specifically use the astrological associations to get an effective reading and to use the cards. And a lot of people don't use those at all. So I just thought when I saw these that they were just really, really cool. I love the colors. There's the Hermit. And this is interesting. Here we're bringing in even beyond the 7 classical planets. Now we have Neptune up there. And I loved this Wheel of Fortune. We have the wheel represented as the Ouroboros, the serpent biting its own tail. We have a really cool depiction going around the outside of these creatures. This form here has taken on some kind of a dragon. We still have the Sphinx at the top, and typically where we see the snake, the apex serpent going down, this is now a depiction of Capricorn, the goat with the fish tail, and the 4 zodiacal cherubs that we normally see in the corners are now on the inside. Isn't that interesting? And we have the numbers down here. Now these numbers might be confusing to people who don't know about the Hebrew letters. Remember I told you that every Hebrew letter also has a numerical value, that the first 10 correspond to just 1 through 10, but then you go beyond that and they start counting off by 10. So then 20, 30, 40, etc. I really love that Tower card. The colors on these are just really, really great. Here's the star. Here's the moon. So let's just do a side-by-side comparison. The Esoterico moon. And you can see the similarities and the differences there. But you do still see the same letter. And we see that the attribution of this card with Zadi corresponding to the sign Cancer here, we can see that that makes some sense because we do have the crab, but Zadi is not typically going to correspond to Cancer. It usually corresponds to Aquarius, and that is true in the Sefer Yetzirah, that's true in the Golden Dawn, and it's also true here in the Grand Esoterico. We see the little Aquarius sign right there. Now, although Golden Dawn would have moved this one over, and so Zadi and Aquarius would have both corresponded to the star and not the moon, you can see that the letter and the sign are still kept together, even though they might move forward one card. Although this makes some sense, I'm still curious about how BALBI came up with these attributes, if he just kind of decided on his own what made the most sense. Did he make up his own system, or did he use somebody else's source material? I'm not quite sure. There is the sun. El Mundo. A couple of these now are out of order because there we see El Loco, the fool. Look at here, he's got a tiger. Don't you love that? If you recall, the Esoterico fool was a big departure. That's where we had the guy with the tall pointy hat, but look at the Worth fool. And you'll see a lot of similarity. Now, what looks like a wild, rabid cat biting his leg there, we see has become a tiger. But you can definitely see, even with the beard, the stance, the sort of outfit here, that there's definitely an influence from Worth in the BALBI deck. And then we'll just take a look at those 2 chariots as well. And we do see that he's got this big flaming sword here that he's added in this deck. So while I love the images, I'm really not sure about how he came up with some of the astrological associations, but I definitely think that these cards are very, very cool, and I'm excited now to look at the minors. But I see right off the bat that I really am connected with these. Now, this is we see that same zodiacal wheel from the front, and this is the Ace of Pentacles. And that's the 2. Now, these are different than the Esoterico. Look at the 4 of Pentacles. But still derived from that old Picard book. And remember, we saw those descriptions were also in that more recently published Encyclopedia of Occult Sciences. The 5, though, is a little bit reminiscent because we see that pentagram here. So we see some of the images of sacred geometry. But I have to say, I think that I like the majors of the Grand Esoterico better, although I love the colors. But I like the minors of these much better. I think that these are really, really beautiful. And just the way that they're so brightly colored, it just brings some inspiration. Look at that. There's the 6 and the tree. So I really like these a lot. There's the 10. And then the way that these are laid out, the next 4 cards are the court cards, but they're numbered. So the page becomes 11, the knight becomes 12, queen, and then the king there. And who knows who this guy is? Apparently he's probably somebody, right? I like him. Now you guys know that the 4 minor suits correspond to the 4 elements, right? And the pentacles correspond to earth. And as such, they correspond to things like money, possessions, your job, your career, your worldly life, as opposed to your higher spiritual life. We're going to look at cups now. Even if you know nothing about the tarot, you could probably take a guess that the element that corresponds to cups would be water, right? Cups hold water. However, check this out. If you will notice, the symbols, I love this. So this looks like a trip like back in the 70s, they were doing a little mind-altering substances and staring at the 3 of Cups, right? If you'll notice the symbols, we have here butterflies. And then we have birds. Now let's take a look at some of the symbols in the last deck. Do you guys remember this one? We see the butterflies, and then we see the egg. Well, the egg corresponds to what? Birds. There we see a bird on the 4. And here we saw the owl on the 5. So again, we can see some similarity between these 2 cards. A lot of similarity, actually. We just see a lot more kind of movement in this one. But the symbols that we're seeing are all symbols of air. Birds and butterflies. And so in both of these decks, the suit of cups actually corresponds to air. And it's not just an assumption that I'm making based on what I'm seeing here. This is actually the way that they've laid it out. That's what Picard did as well. And it's just very difficult for me to understand why cups would correspond to air. You know, I just can't really make that connection. There are plenty of other things when there's a different association than what I use, and I can still make sense of it. For instance, in the Wicca religion, wands correspond to air and swords correspond to fire. And I can kind of understand why they would say that. So a wand, they guess you think of like moving it through the air, and the sword corresponding to fire as being a symbol of the divine masculine. I also think of even like a flaming sword like we saw in the Charioteer, or you think of Archangel Michael and his flaming sword. Even the sharpness of a flame coming to a point similar to a sword, or even a spade, which is the corresponding playing card suit. So I can understand that correspondence. I can see switching wands and swords in their attributes, and they're both still masculine energies, they're both still active elements. So that to me is not the strangest thing in the world. But this making cups air is strange to me, and that means that swords now becomes the suit of water. So let's take a look at the swords. Again, beautiful. I've got to say, I love this image. I'm excited to do a reading with this deck. And you won't see it right off the bat, but here we begin to see, there's the fish. You might remember that's similar in the other deck. Here we see the sign of Cancer. And we see this kind of blue background. There's not a lot of water imagery here, but there we see the fish again. We see some moons all around, and moons are very much a water symbol. And then here we see the court cards. Again, he looks like he's by the sea. The queen has the Cancer symbol on her right here. So cardinal water. And the King of Swords, this was the guy from Italy. Don't remember his name, but one of Italy's most celebrated playing card collectors. There he is. Now, when we look at the Grand Esoterico, we see a lot more water imagery in the swords. We see the whole background is water. We see waves down here below, so it's very easy to see and connect the fact that swords are corresponding to water. And then our final suit here is the suit of wands. In this deck, wands and pentacles are their classical attributes, so wands corresponding to fire. And one thing that I think is really interesting is that, see these little flames here? They look very much like the letter Yod, the Hebrew letter. And we see them as a motif throughout the suit of wands. And the letter Yod is the first letter of the Tetragrammaton, the first letter of the divine name of God, the fourfold name. We see one right here. This is a good example. So the 4 letters of the Tetragrammaton are Yod, He, Vav, He. And we see those around the Wheel of Fortune. And we see them also hidden within the Rider-Waite deck. And each of the 4 letters corresponds to one of the elements. And the Yod corresponds to fire. So I don't know if this was intentional, but I believe that it was, that this kind of shape is here as not only a little flame, but also as that Hebrew letter, because remember, we did see that BALBI was a student of the Kabbalah, so I think that's why he chose to do that. And then here we see the family of wands. What do you guys think about this deck? The imagery is pretty cool, right? Let's see if I can get these together and not mix up with all these other decks. Well, I'm really excited about these. I think that they are an important piece of the puzzle. Like I said, I still don't understand exactly how some of the attributes are in there, but I do have to say I appreciate the fact that we're even getting those symbols. Even if they're not where I expect them to be, I actually would almost rather see a deck include the astrological signs to give me an opportunity to have them in there than to just not put them in there at all. And I kind of think that it's a shame that it's not more widely recognized that the planetary sciences and astrology and the tarot are as woven together as they are. I sometimes feel like people are either like, I'm an astrologer or I'm a tarot reader, and they don't necessarily recognize that there's such a great overlap in those two practices. So let's go ahead and draw one card for today. So while I'm shuffling, why don't you guys think about a question that you have, just whatever it is that you need a little bit of guidance, and you can make your question very specific today if you want. I think that it would be good to think about something that you really need an answer to. Okay, so we'll see what the deck has to say, and I'm just going to cut one time and go ahead and turn over the top card. All right, let's see what we've got here. Oh, strength. Okay, so how can we apply this to your situation? Now, strength is not the card of muscular dominance. Strength is the card of inner strength, holding your center line and being calm and being patient, yet also holding your ground. So what we see in this card is this woman that's holding the lion's jaw, right? She's not getting out her whip and chair and beating the lion into submission. And she's also not letting the lion attack her. She's using her core, she's being centered within herself, and by doing that, she's staying calm, and when she's calm, the lion is calm. So think about your situation and think about this idea of having some inner strength, staying calm and being patient, and when you are in that kind of state, then you can get the lion under control and get the lion to do what you need it to do, okay? So I hope that that helped you out a little bit. Thank you guys so much for joining me and delving deeper into the esoteric mysteries of the tarot. I really, really appreciate all of you who have kept coming back for this entire series. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe if you haven't already, and I do want to mention that there is going to be a part 3 to this. So yes, there is another deck that I'm going to be taking a look at before this is all done, and hopefully in the meantime I can find a little bit more out about this and come back to you guys with some answers in that video. So I hope you guys have a great weekend, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.